The sun was dipping low over the red canyons of Arizona, casting long shadows across the Bennett family ranch. The cattle were quiet, the wind carried the scent of dry sage, and the lonely cry of a hawk echoed through the fading light. It was a peaceful evening, but for Thomas Bennett, peace had long been a stranger. He stood by the corral fence, hands rough and weathered, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the glare. His ranch stretched for miles, open land, rolling hills, and the whisper of a past that refused to die. For years he had worked this land alone, raising 2 daughters after losing his wife to fever one cold winter. The house had once been filled with laughter, but now it was filled only with echoes. Maggie and June, his daughters, had gone away for a short visit to town 2 days ago. They were grown now. Maggie, the eldest, had her mother's gentle eyes and her father's stubborn will, while June, the younger, carried a spirit wild as the desert wind. Thomas missed them terribly whenever they were gone, though he rarely said it aloud. He leaned against the fence post, staring into the orange horizon, wondering when they'd be back. The land was unforgiving, trails were long and often treacherous. He had taught his girls how to ride, how to shoot, how to survive, but a father's heart never rests easy. Inside the small ranch house, the fire flickered weakly in the hearth. The chair beside it was empty, the same one his wife used to sit in while she sewed or hummed old lullabies. Her portrait hung above the mantel, gathering dust. He had never taken it down, though some days it hurt just to look at it. The night deepened, coyotes howled in the distance. Thomas poured himself a small drink of whiskey and sat by the window, waiting. The world outside was a mix of silver moonlight and whispering winds. Then, faintly, through the stillness, came the sound of hooves 2 horses, galloping hard and fast. He stood up quickly, his heart leaping. It had to be them. He grabbed his rifle out of instinct, though he doubted he'd need it. The sound drew closer until he could see their shapes in the moonlight, Maggie and June riding side by side. Relief washed over him until he noticed something strange. A third figure rode behind them, slumped slightly, smaller and wrapped in a blanket. The girls' faces were tense, illuminated by the faint glow from the house lantern. They weren't just returning home, they were bringing someone with them. Thomas stepped outside, boots crunching over the dry dirt. The horses came to a stop near the porch. Maggie dismounted first, helping the stranger off the horse. The figure stumbled, weak and trembling, and that's when Thomas saw her, an Apache woman, her dark hair matted, her clothes torn, her skin streaked with dust and dried blood. The night air seemed to freeze. Maggie's eyes met her father's, pleading, determined. June clutched the woman's arm gently, supporting her weight. The stranger swayed, clearly injured, but her eyes, deep, defiant, and filled with quiet pain, met Thomas's for a brief, startling moment. Without a word, they brought her inside. Thomas followed, silent, conflicted. The ranch that had long stood, still, now felt suddenly alive again, with tension, mystery, and something unspoken that stirred deep within the walls. He watched as Maggie and June laid the woman near the fire, covering her with a quilt. She winced as they cleaned the wound on her shoulder, a gunshot graze, raw and ugly. Whoever she was, she had been running. Outside, the night continued to whisper secrets, but inside, something new had begun to take root. A spark that would soon grow into a fire neither Thomas nor his daughters could contain. The old ranch, once silent and lonely, now held 3 hearts and a stranger with eyes like the storm. As Thomas looked down at her, at the woman who had appeared out of nowhere, carried by fate into his world, he didn't yet know how deeply she would change everything he thought he knew about love. Loyalty and the wild land he called home. The fire crackled softly, the woman's breathing steadied, and somewhere outside the window a coyote cried long and low, as if the desert itself sensed that the Bennett ranch would never be the same again. The morning sun spilled softly across the Bennett ranch, gilding the fences in gold and touching the dry earth with warmth. The night had been long, restless. Thomas had hardly slept, sitting by the fire until dawn, watching the Apache woman as she lay unconscious. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her face calm beneath the soot and blood. Maggie had dozed off in the chair beside her, while June curled up by the hearth, her arm over her eyes. They looked exhausted, yet peaceful, two daughters who had risked the dangers of the desert to save a stranger. Thomas finally rose as the rooster crowed. He poured water from the basin and splashed his face, feeling the sting of cold wake him. He glanced back toward the woman. Something about her presence unsettled him, not in fear, but in a way he couldn't quite name. The ranch had always been his kingdom of order. He knew every sound, every trail, every shift in the wind. But since last night, that order had been disturbed. The stranger had brought with her a weight, a history written in silence and blood. By the time the sun climbed higher, Maggie stirred awake. She gently checked the woman's wound, changing the bandage they had wrapped the night before. The bleeding had stopped. Beneath the roughness of pain, the woman's features seemed almost serene. Her cheekbones sharp, her lips full, her long black hair tangled but beautiful even in disarray. Thomas stepped outside, breathing in the scent of dust and sage. He stared out at the land stretching toward the horizon, a world he understood. Out there, he could read every sign, every shadow. But inside that small cabin, with that woman sleeping near his fire, he felt lost. Hours passed. The cattle needed tending. The fences needed mending. He worked silently, trying to lose himself in the rhythm of ranch life. But his mind wandered back to her. When he returned to the house near midday, she was awake, weak, sitting up slowly. June had given her water, and the girls watched her with curiosity and kindness. She didn't speak, but her eyes moved, sharp and aware, scanning the room, the door, the man standing in it. There was fear there, and pride, a blend of both that told Thomas this woman had seen more hardship than most men could bear. She tried to stand but winced, clutching her shoulder. Maggie helped her sit again. The air was thick with quiet understanding. No one asked her name. No one needed to. Outside, a hawk cried, circling high above the canyon rim. The ranch was alive again, though in a strange and uncertain way. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, Thomas lit a fire in the yard. The air cooled fast at dusk, and the desert came alive with the hum of crickets. His daughters joined him, tired from tending to chores. Inside, the Apache woman rested again. Thomas's mind replayed every possible story of what could have happened to her. The borderlands were dangerous, outlaws, bounty hunters, and old tribal feuds still scarred the territory. He'd heard of Apache camps, burned by raiders, of women fleeing soldiers and slavers alike. Maybe she was one of them. Maybe she had nowhere left to go. Night fell heavy. The fire crackled, throwing orange light against the wooden posts. For the first time in years, Thomas felt something stirring beneath the loneliness that had gripped his heart since his wife's passing. He didn't understand it, didn't even want to, but it was there. Inside the cabin, the woman opened her eyes again. She stared into the firelight, flickering through the window. Her hand brushed over the bandage on her shoulder, tracing the edge of the cloth gently. She didn't know this place. She didn't know these people who had risked sheltering her. But something about the quiet steadiness of the man outside, the one who hadn't spoken but had watched over her all night, felt strangely familiar. There was sorrow in his silence, the kind only those who had lost something dear could carry. As the night deepened, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint rhythm of drums far off in the desert, distant, fading echoes of her people. Her eyes glistened as she listened, remembering fires that once danced under the same stars, faces she might never see again. She turned away from the window and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would come with choices, whether to stay or run, whether to trust these strangers or disappear before dawn. But sleep took her before she could decide. Outside, Thomas sat long after his daughters had gone to bed, the stars burning bright above him. He thought of the world changing around them, of a land growing crueler, divided by fear and pride. And now, here was this woman, caught between those worlds, brought into his home by the daughters he loved more than life itself. He couldn't yet see the path this would lead them down, but deep inside, a quiet sense of fate began to stir. Something about her presence, about the way she had arrived, broken and silent under the desert moon, felt like more than chance. The Bennett ranch had been quiet for too long. Now it carried the heartbeat of something new, fragile, uncertain, and alive. As the fire dwindled and the last embers turned to ash, the sound of distant horses echoed faintly across the ridge. Thomas lifted his head, frowning. Riders, somewhere out there in the dark. And he knew without a word that the peace of the ranch would not last. Dawn came heavy with dust and silence. The first streaks of light touched the dry hills surrounding the Bennett ranch, painting them gold and crimson. The day should have felt ordinary, the sound of cattle stirring, the low hum of wind brushing through the mesquite. But there was unease in the air, a tension that clung to the land like mist. Thomas Bennett stood on the porch, boots firm against the worn planks, his eyes fixed on the distant ridge. The sound he'd heard the night before, faint, ghostly hoofbeats, had not been a dream. Something or someone had been out there watching. Inside, his daughters moved quietly about the house. Maggie was preparing breakfast, her mind clearly elsewhere, while June fetched water from the well. The Apache woman still rested on the cot near the hearth, her face pale but calm. She hadn't spoken a word since she'd arrived. The girls had started calling her the quiet one. Thomas glanced back through the window. She was awake now, sitting upright, watching the morning light filter through the curtains. The scarlet of her blanket contrasted against the pale wood of the floor. There was grace in her stillness, like a wild creature resting but never fully tamed. He knew she must have a story. Wounds like hers didn't come from misfortune, they came from violence. And violence, in these parts, always had a reason. The day carried on. Thomas tried to work the land as usual, checking the fence lines, tending to the livestock, but his thoughts stayed tangled in uncertainty. Each creak of the windmill, each shadow across the prairie, reminded him that the world outside the ranch was not safe. By mid-afternoon, June spotted movement beyond the canyon road, two distant figures on horseback, riding slow but deliberate. She told Maggie in hushed tones, and together they watched from the porch. The men were too far to recognize, but their silhouettes carried the unmistakable bearing of riders with purpose. Thomas soon joined them. He stood behind his daughters, narrowing his eyes. The riders didn't approach the ranch directly. They lingered on the outskirts, circling near the dry creek bed before disappearing into the ravine. It was an old trick, scouts surveying before making a move. He said nothing, but inside, a cold certainty took hold. Someone was looking for her. That night, as the sun sank and the desert cooled, the tension grew thicker. Coyotes howled, and the ranch dogs barked nervously toward the canyon. Inside, the girls sat close to the fire. Maggie read quietly from an old book, her eyes flicking often to the woman lying nearby. June brushed the stranger's hair, untangling it gently. The woman didn't resist, her eyes closed as if the simple act of kindness soothed her spirit. Thomas stood by the door, rifle resting against the frame. He had lived through raids, droughts, and storms, but this felt different. It wasn't nature threatening his home now. It was men, and men could be far crueler than any force of weather. Hours later, the house was silent. The girls had gone to bed, and the fire had burned low. Thomas sat by the window, watching the horizon under the light of a thin moon. Then, faintly, he saw it, a flicker of movement near the old cottonwoods by the creek. A shadow slipped between the trees. His hand moved instinctively to his rifle. He stepped outside, his boots soundless on the dirt. The wind had died completely, and every sound carried his breath, the crunch of gravel, the distant snort of a horse. When he reached the fence line, he paused, scanning the dark. There, just beyond the tree line, a glint of metal caught the moonlight. A rifle barrel, he ducked low, moving along the corral, heart pounding with controlled precision. Whoever was out there hadn't expected to be seen. They lingered, watching the house, waiting for something, or someone. He slipped back inside, careful not to wake his daughters. The Apache woman, however, was awake. Her eyes were open, calm, steady, and aware. She had known they were coming. Thomas didn't speak. He didn't need to. She understood. Their eyes met for a brief, silent moment, two souls from worlds apart, yet bound by the same instinct for survival. The hours until dawn were long and sleepless. The stranger in the dark didn't make a move. But Thomas knew this was only the beginning. Whoever wanted her wasn't giving up easily. When morning finally broke, the air felt heavy, almost expectant. Maggie stepped outside to fetch wood and found a sign nailed to the fence post. A piece of weathered paper, scrawled in rough ink, a bounty notice. It named no name, only a description: Apache woman, escaped prisoner, dangerous, reward $200. Thomas's blood ran cold. His daughters stared at the paper, their faces pale. The woman inside sat quietly, unaware of what had been found, but Thomas knew then that their lives had crossed into dangerous ground. Sheltering her meant becoming targets themselves. The law wouldn't protect them. The bounty hunters would come, ruthless and relentless. He tore the paper from the post and burned it in the fire. The smoke rose through the chimney, vanishing into the clear morning sky. From that moment, the Bennett Ranch was no longer just a home. It was a fortress, a secret haven against the wrath of men who hunted for gold and vengeance. The Apache woman sat by the window, sunlight glinting in her dark eyes. Her expression carried both gratitude and sorrow, as if she already knew the cost of being saved. Thomas turned toward the open land, his jaw set. He had lived alone for years, his heart buried with his wife. But now, with his daughters and this mysterious woman under his roof, he felt a purpose awaken, something fierce, something dangerous, something alive. The world outside was closing in, and before long, blood would be spilled on the dust of the Bennett Ranch. The desert dawn arrived painted in hues of scarlet and gold, but its beauty could not hide the shadow that now lingered over the Bennett Ranch. The bounty notice had changed everything. What had once been a refuge had now become a mark on a map, a place that would soon draw men hungry for coin and blood. Thomas Bennett stood by the corral, scanning the horizon as he had done every morning for years, but this time there was no calm in the ritual. The silence of the land felt wrong, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Inside the house, the Apache woman sat by the window, her dark hair braided loosely over her shoulder. Her wound had begun to heal, but her spirit bore scars far deeper than flesh. She had not spoken since she arrived, though her eyes seemed to hold entire stories, stories of loss, fire, and a will that refused to die. Maggie tended the horses, while June worked near the barn, trying to keep things normal. But even their laughter, the kind that once filled the ranch with life, had turned quiet, cautious, like the whispers of birds before dusk. Thomas watched his daughters, his heart heavy. They were brave, stronger than most men he'd known, yet still too young to understand the kind of cruelty the world could deliver. He had buried his wife when they were small, and from that day forward he'd sworn that no harm would ever touch them again. Now, that promise felt fragile. By midday, the sun burned high, and the horizon shimmered with heat. That's when Thomas saw it, a faint cloud of dust in the distance, riders, moving slow, deliberate, maybe 3 or 4 of them. He walked back to the house without a word, every step measured. Inside, he found Maggie cleaning her hands by the wash basin. Her face paled when she saw his expression. June looked up from the table, sensing it too. The woman by the window didn't move, but her body stiffened, as though she could feel danger long before it showed its face. The riders came closer as the day wore on, their silhouettes sharpening against the bright desert light. Thomas watched from the upper window, heart steady but mind racing. He knew how this would go. Bounty hunters always came smiling first, polite enough to lower suspicion, cruel enough to strike when the moment came. By sundown they reached the front gate. 4 men, dust, caked and lean, their eyes hard beneath their hats. They looked like every other kind of trouble the frontier bred, desperate men chasing profit, not justice. Thomas stepped outside to meet them. The air between them hung heavy with unspoken truths. Though no words were exchanged, each man knew the other's purpose. One hunter nodded toward the house, another spat into the dirt, resting his hand on his holster. Time stretched long and still. Then slowly they turned their horses away, heading toward the ridge as if leaving. But Thomas knew better. Men like that didn't ride all this way just to go home empty-handed. They would circle back under darkness. When night fell, the desert grew quiet again. The stars were sharp above, cold and endless. Maggie and June pretended to sleep, but Thomas could hear them shifting, unable to rest. The woman, however, sat awake near the dying fire, her eyes reflecting the flames. She seemed to sense what was coming as if she had lived this moment before. Near midnight, the dogs began to bark, low, then frenzied. Thomas moved fast, grabbing his rifle from beside the door. The girls stirred, fear flashing across their faces. Outside, shadows moved near the barn, quick, precise, deliberate. The hunters had returned. Thomas slipped quietly out the back, boots sinking into the cool sand. He moved like a ghost between the fences, the weight of the rifle steady in his hands. The men were at the stable now, whispering among themselves, the glint of their weapons catching the moonlight. Inside the house, Maggie helped the Apache woman toward the trapdoor beneath the floorboards, a hiding place Thomas had built years ago for storing grain during raids. The woman resisted for a moment, her eyes burning with pride, but Maggie pressed her gently, and finally she descended into the darkness below. Outside, a horse whinnied sharply, the sound of movement too sudden to be quiet. Then a voice called out, followed by the cock of a revolver. The stillness shattered. Thomas fired first. The rifle cracked through the night, echoing off the canyon walls. A man dropped instantly, his gun clattering to the ground. The others scattered, shouting. Bullets tore through the barn walls. Sparks flew as one hit the metal water trough. Maggie screamed for her sister to stay down as glass shattered near the window. June clutched her tightly, both crouching behind the table as dust and splinters rained from above. Thomas moved between shadows, every shot deliberate. Years of hard living had taught him patience, how to wait for breath, how to let instinct take aim. 2 more men fell before the rest turned and fled into the desert night. leaving only silence behind them. The air was thick with gunpowder and fear. The cattle moaned restlessly in the corral, and the dogs whimpered near the porch. Thomas stood still for a long moment, the barrel of his rifle smoking faintly in the cool air. When he finally stepped inside, Maggie ran to him, tears streaking her face. June followed, clutching his arm. He said nothing, only looked around at the shattered windows, the splintered wood, the blood darkening the dirt outside. Then, from beneath the floorboards, the Apache woman emerged. Her eyes searched his face, a look not of fear, but of understanding. In her silence was gratitude, and something more, something unspoken, ancient, and powerful. Thomas had not asked for this. He had not sought to fight anyone's war but his own. Yet the moment he saw her there, framed by firelight and shadow, he knew that fate had brought her to his doorstep for a reason. The ranch, once a place of quiet labor and forgotten grief, had become a refuge for a hunted soul, and in protecting her, Thomas had set himself and his daughters on a path that could no longer be undone. The desert wind rose softly through the broken window, carrying the faint scent of rain, a rare promise in that harsh land. But to Thomas it smelled of change, and as the night faded into a pale dawn, he knew the hunters would return. Not with 4 men this time, but more. And when they came, the Bennett Ranch would have to stand like a fortress once again. The Bennett Ranch lay bruised under the pale morning light. Smoke still hung low from the gunfire of the night before, curling around the barn and drifting lazily over the corrals. The land was silent except for the restless movement of cattle and the faint creak of the windmill turning in the breeze. Thomas Bennett stood alone near the fence line, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had buried the 2 dead men before sunrise, the bounty hunters who had fallen in the darkness. The graves were shallow, their markers nothing more than rough stones, but it was all they would get. The desert would do the rest. The weight of what had happened pressed heavy on his chest. He had defended his home as any man would, but he knew that the quiet wouldn't last. Men who hunted for gold did not stop after failure. They regrouped, returned with more guns, more fury. And this time they would come not as shadows, but as a storm. Inside the house, the Apache woman sat at the table, her wound wrapped fresh, her dark eyes fixed on the small flame of the oil lamp. Maggie and June moved about quietly, gathering supplies, repairing what could be salvaged. The girls no longer treated the woman as a stranger. The fear had faded, replaced by a kind of solemn bond born of shared danger. June brought her water, and the woman took it with both hands, nodding slightly. Still, she did not speak, but her silence had a power to it, something strong and proud, as though words were not needed. Thomas returned inside and studied her from the doorway. There was a hardness to her now that hadn't been there when she first arrived, a readiness, a quiet fire in her eyes. It was the look of someone who had been hunted too long and had decided to stop running. He knew that look. He had seen it once before, years ago, in his own reflection after burying his wife. The will to survive, no matter the cost. By midday, the ranch was busy with preparation. Maggie and June gathered ammunition from the old chest. Thomas reinforced the shutters and set traps near the trail. Every motion was deliberate. The ranch was no longer a home, it was a fortress. The Apache woman watched him work. Then slowly she rose and went outside. Her bare feet made no sound as she crossed the dirt. She walked to the edge of the corral, where the land opened wide toward the hills. There she knelt, pressing her palm flat against the earth. Her lips moved silently, not words Thomas could understand, but a prayer, maybe, or a promise. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Thomas saddled his horse and rode to the ridge. From there he could see the long road winding through the desert, empty for now. but he knew better. Tracks would appear soon. Dust would rise again. The land was cruelly honest. It hid nothing for long. When he returned, the smell of smoke reached him before the sight did. His heart stopped cold. The barn, their oldest structure, filled with hay and tools, was burning. Flames clawed at the sky, devouring the dry timber. He spurred his horse forward, shouting for his daughters. Maggie and June ran from the house, their faces pale with fear. The Apache woman was already there, pulling buckets from the well, her movements quick, precise. Together they fought the fire, the night filled with heat and choking smoke, the roar of collapsing beams echoing through the valley. Sparks rained across the dirt like fireflies. They worked until their arms trembled, until every drop of water was gone. When the last flames died, nothing remained but blackened wood and ash. The barn was gone. The horses, their best stock, were gone too. Thomas fell to his knees, the exhaustion cutting deep into his bones. His daughters knelt beside him, tears streaking through soot. The Apache woman stood silently behind them, her face unreadable, but her eyes turned toward the hills, and her body tensed like a predator, scenting the wind. In that moment, Thomas realized the fire had not been an accident. It had been a message. The bounty hunters were close enough to strike under the cover of darkness. He rose slowly, his fists clenched. Every piece of him, every scar and memory, hardened into resolve. He had lost too much already. He would not lose his daughters, or the woman they had risked everything to save. As the first light of dawn touched the blackened remains of the barn, Thomas began to plan. He mapped every approach, every ridge and gully, every blind spot the hunters might use. The Apache woman joined him without being asked. She pointed to the canyon north of the property, narrow, with high rocks on both sides. A perfect place for an ambush. Though no words passed between them, they understood each other. Two survivors, two souls bound by duty, ready to defend what little life the desert had spared them. The day passed in quiet tension. The girls prepared food, packed ammunition, and reinforced the doors. The air was thick with the smell of char and fear, but beneath it all was a flicker of something else, unity. For the first time in years, the Bennetts did not stand alone. As twilight came, the world held its breath. The dogs began to growl low, their fur rising. Dust rose on the far edge of the horizon once more. They were coming. Thomas gripped his rifle, the wood warm beneath his hand. He looked once toward his daughters, then toward the woman standing beside the doorway, her hair unbound, her eyes fierce and steady. The firelight from the ruined barn still glowed faintly behind them, painting the ground in hues of red and gold. It felt like the last calm before the storm. Far off, a horn sounded, long, mournful, and close. The horses neighed nervously. The earth trembled under the weight of hooves. Thomas exhaled slowly, steady as stone. The next sunrise would decide everything. The final dawn rose over the Bennett ranch, pale and trembling with the first hints of heat. The air carried no bird song that morning, only the restless sigh of wind brushing across the scorched remains of the barn. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath. Thomas Bennett stood on the porch, rifle in hand, watching the horizon turn from gray to gold. The faint haze of dust in the distance told him what he already knew. They were coming. The men who had set fire to his barn, who had hunted the woman hiding within his home, were returning to finish what they started. He had seen enough of death in his years to understand the signs. There would be no mercy in what was coming. Inside the house, Maggie and June prepared silently, their movements slow but steady. Fear clung to them, but so did resolve. They had grown up under their father's watchful eye, hardened by the desert's lessons, how to stand firm, how to endure. Today, those lessons would be tested like never before. The Apache woman, The one who had come into their lives like a shadow and stayed like a flame stood near the doorway. Her wound had healed enough for her to move freely, and now she wore a makeshift leather belt that held one of Thomas's revolvers. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable, but in her eyes burned a quiet determination that matched the rising sun. Thomas gave her a brief nod, a gesture of respect. They had shared no words since the night of the fire, but words were not needed between them. They both understood what was at stake. By mid-morning, the dust cloud on the horizon had thickened. The riders were close now more than before, perhaps 10 or 12, their dark silhouettes crawling across the desert like a line of locusts. Their leader rode in front, a tall figure with a wide hat and a coat that flapped in the wind. They stopped at the edge of the property, surveying the silent ranch. The ground shimmered with heat, and for a moment everything was still, a pause before chaos. Then came the whistle. It sliced through the air like a blade, and in an instant the quiet exploded. Gunfire cracked across the plain. The first bullets struck the fence posts, splintering wood. Another tore through a window shutter. Thomas ducked low, returning fire with calm precision. His rifle spoke in deep, measured rhythm, one shot, one breath, one more man falling from his saddle. Maggie and June crouched near the kitchen window, reloading with trembling hands but unshaken hearts. The Apache woman moved like the wind, slipping from cover to cover, firing with deadly accuracy. The men outside shouted in anger and surprise. They had expected an easy bounty, not a fortress defended by fire and fury. The battle stretched into the heart of the day. The smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air. The ranch that had once been a quiet refuge now echoed with violence and survival. Thomas fought from the porch, his movements deliberate, his eyes never leaving the ridgeline. He saw the leader, the man in the coat, moving closer through the smoke, firing with deadly skill. Each time Thomas aimed, the man shifted like a ghost. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw one of the hunters slip around the back of the barn's ruins, heading straight toward the house. He shouted for his daughters, but his voice was drowned by the roar of gunfire. Inside, June turned too late. The man burst through the side door, revolver raised. The Apache woman moved first, swift and silent, driving her shoulder into him with the strength of a wildcat. They crashed into the table, the gun going off once, shattering a glass jar. The struggle was brutal, but short. The woman seized the hunter's knife and drove it into his chest, her movements sure and unflinching. When she rose, blood streaked her arm, but her eyes burned brighter than ever. Outside, Thomas dropped another rider, then another. But his luck, like the day, was burning away fast. A shot grazed his shoulder, spinning him back. He stumbled, gripping the post for balance. His vision blurred, but his mind stayed clear. He could not stop now. Not when his daughters were still inside. Maggie ran to help him, but he raised a hand, motioning her back. She understood. He was not fighting to live anymore. He was fighting to make sure they did. The final push came near sunset. The last few hunters, desperate and furious, charged the house. They made it as far as the yard before Thomas and the Apache woman stood side by side, rifles leveled, and unleashed everything they had left. Smoke and flame swallowed the world. Horses screamed. The ground shook beneath the thunder of gunfire. When it was over, the desert went silent again. Thomas stood in the doorway, breathing hard, the rifle slipping from his hands. Around him the ranch was half ruined, smoke rising from the earth, walls pocked with bullet holes. Maggie and June rushed out, their faces streaked with dirt and tears, but alive. The Apache woman stood a few steps away, her revolver still smoking, her chest heaving with exhaustion. Their eyes met one last time, and for a moment no one moved. In that silence, something passed between them, not love in the way most people understood it, but something deeper. A bond forged not in words, but in fire, blood, and survival. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the sun dipped low over the canyons. The wind caught her hair, carrying it like dark silk through the golden light. She looked back at the Bennett family, at the man who had given her shelter, at the daughters who had given her kindness, and she understood what must come next. The world beyond the ranch would never stop hunting her, but here she had found something sacred, not safety, but belonging. Thomas knew it too. He had lost his wife to sickness, lost peace to time, but through this woman, this survivor from another world, he had found purpose again. She had brought his daughter's courage, his home meaning, and his own heart back to life. As twilight fell, she stepped away from the house, moving toward the open desert. Thomas did not stop her. He knew that some souls were meant to wander, free, untamed, and eternal. The girls watched until she disappeared into the last light of day, her figure fading against the red horizon. The Bennett ranch stood battered but alive. The land had taken blood, but it had also given back something rare, hope. That night, as the stars filled the sky, Thomas sat on the porch with his daughters, staring into the endless dark. The world was still wild, still cruel, but for the first time in years, he felt the quiet peace of a man who had done what was right. And somewhere out in the desert, beneath the same sky, the Apache woman rode alone, her spirit forever tied to the family who had chosen to protect her, and the cowboy who had learned to live again.